With this video, we'll be beginning a new series in the area of metaphysics, and that is a series on Edward Feser's book, Scholastic Metaphysics, A Contemporary Introduction. And what we'll see in this book is the way in which the scholastics, figures like Thomas Aquinas, John Duns Scotus, Francisco Suarez, William of Ockham, and others, but those are the main figures, the way in which they inherited Aristotle's metaphysics and developed it, enriched it in intricate detail over many centuries, about 500 years, and therefore, in this way, formed the core of Western metaphysics, the Western tradition of metaphysics. They consolidated what Plato and Aristotle and the ancient Greeks and Hellenistic philosophers had done, and they provided the platform and really the background against which modern metaphysics and indeed modern science itself developed. And so Feser's approach is to bring the scholastics in dialogue not only with Aristotle, but also, and really primarily, with the contemporary metaphysics that you find in analytic philosophy. And so you get his subtitle, A Contemporary Introduction. This serves as an introduction in a twofold sense. It's both an introduction to scholastic metaphysics and an introduction to modern analytic metaphysics. And so it does double duty for us in this way. Now, the way that Feser approaches this is really, I think, informed both by his interpretation of scholastic metaphysics, but also by the kinds of concerns that analytic metaphysicians will be most interested in. And analytic metaphysics grew up out of logical positivism, the Vienna Circle that originated in the early part of the 20th century in Vienna, and then migrated due to one Adolf Hitler to the English-speaking world, Britain and the United States, and came to be the dominant academic paradigm of philosophy. And their concern was, above all, with philosophy of science and scientific philosophy, and the way in which logical and mathematical methods, distinctive of philosophy, could inform our understanding of science. But they very much took it to be the case that philosophy is subordinate to science, that its aim is to understand science, is to maybe conceptually clean up science, and it's not necessarily to make any radical new innovations in the sphere of our understanding of reality. And in this respect, it's diametrically opposed to scholasticism, which did take itself to be a more foundational inquiry into the nature of reality. However, with the demise of logical positivism and the morphing of that paradigm into what we now know as analytic philosophy, metaphysics really came back into the fore. And so Feser sees here a opening, and he's not the first. He's following a number of other individuals who have recognized this previously, an opening for scholastic metaphysics to get a new look from within the analytic tradition. So that forms an important part of the background. But it also, I think, informs the way in which Feser presents the scholastic system, because logical positivism, with its concern with science, really set the tone for analytic philosophy. And one of the central issues or interests that a philosopher of science is naturally going to have is with the understanding of causal relationships, especially, of course, causal relationships among natural objects. And so Feser is interested in how scholastic metaphysics, with its understanding of causation, can perhaps provide a kind of entree into the debates that are pre-existing in analytic metaphysics, where this topic of causation is going to be very central. And so with this in mind, he begins his exposition, chapter 1, after some preliminary discussion of scientism and the relation of science and philosophy that we're going to be passing over here. He begins it with the discussion of act and potency, which lays the basis for the scholastic theory of the powers, the causal powers, and therefore allows him to broach this topic of the metaphysics of causation in a way that shows how the dominant empiricist paradigm, derived principally from David Hume, is something that scholasticism can help us to improve upon. And that is one of the ways in which he's going to be, I think, motivating this project of a contemporary introduction to scholasticism. So that gives us a sense of where this is coming from. However, on the other hand, he is also concerned to begin at a very basic introductory level with the way in which, in the ancient Greek philosophical context, Aristotle developed his metaphysics in response to a specific problem of his time, which was the problem of change versus permanence. Problem of change versus permanence. And what we see here is basically an account of the origination of Aristotle's metaphysics that sees it as overcoming a kind of antinomy, an opposition of principles or an opposition of extreme positions between, on the one hand, the Eleatic philosophers, the philosophers who were associated with the city of Elea, known as the Eleatics, and that's Parmenides and Zeno, the most prominent figures, on the one hand, and Heraclitus on the other hand. So we talked about this in our discussion of Aristotle, the way in which Aristotle is trying to frame his understanding of philosophy and its aims in relationship to the great predecessors. But what you get in Feser is kind of a stripped-down version of this that draws a very stark contrast. On the one hand, the Eleatics, with their advocacy of permanence and oneness, versus, on the other hand, Heraclitus with his advocacy of change and multiplicity. So common sense tells us that there is both permanence and permanence and change and kind of unity and multiplicity to reality. But both of these schools of philosophy try to eliminate the other possibility, argue that everything is just change. Heraclitus would frame this in terms of flux or flow. Everything is in a constant state of flux or flow. There is no permanence. There's no stability. Everything is multifarious. There are no units of things. There is no oneness. You might say there is no repetition of types. Everything is new. Everything is its own radical individual. On the other hand, at the other extreme, the Eleatics would say there is only permanence. There is no change. So this is the radical denial of change at all. The radical denial of change at all. And everything is one. There aren't individuals that are separate from each other and distinct. It's all just oneness. And so Feser goes through some of the arguments for this position. He talks about the classic argument of Parmenides that says that if there is to be change, this will require being to arise out of non-being. But out of non-being, nothing can arise. So if change has to arise out of non-being, then it can never arise, and therefore there is no change. Of course, you have the famous paradoxes of Zeno that Feser goes through that are intended to show that change is also impossible, multiplicity is also impossible. And what Feser says about this is that clearly this is not convincing. It's no more convincing than Heraclitus's arguments, and for similar reasons. The idea is that it's not just that we're wedded to common sense, but that the very activity of philosophy itself seems to affirm, at least performatively, at least practically, the reality of both change and permanence. So in the case of the Eleatics, we could say, well, if there's no change, then how is it possible for you to have the thought, there is no change? Isn't it at least the case that one of your thoughts is succeeding the other thought while you're unfolding that more complicated thought? And if you're going to say that appearance suggests that there are changes, but in reality there is no change, aren't you supposing that there is a kind of opposition between appearance and reality? Aren't you supposing that there's an opposition between, your interlocutor that you're addressing and yourself who's informing this person of this, and presumably edifying them with this deep piece of philosophical wisdom? So there seems to be a kind of contradictoriness in even putting forth these sorts of extreme positions. And similar things could be said about Heraclitus. I mean, if there is no permanence at all, if everything is constant flux, then how can you possibly say that even that there is a change? Because if you think about it, I have to be a stable, permanent substance. We saw this when we were talking about Aristotle's idea of the substrate. In order for me to be able to say that something happened after something else, I at least have to be able to perceive it. And there's another problem with this too, which is that it seems like I need to be a kind of stable subject in order even to formulate any kind of argument or coherent thought that there is nothing but flux, nothing but change. So this kind of stability seems to imply that it's a kind of permanence and also a kind of unity, at least the unity, relative unity. It's not absolute unity, certainly, but not a complete multiplicity like the Heraclitean wants to say there is either. And so there are these problems. Now, Feser throws into this a modern consideration, which is that clearly these positions are non-starters because you have the fact of science and the successes of science, which enables us to make generalizations, to talk about types of processes that are regular, which will be denied by Heraclitus, who would claim that everything is constantly being remade and the world is, as it were, totally new in each instant. There is nothing is permanent, including permanent causal processes. And on the other hand, the Parmenidean is going to say, well, we have no change at all, but then what is science describing? Science is describing different types of entities that undergo changes and that relate to each other in certain ways. And so the Parmenidean position that none of this really exists. There's just one constant, being that is absolutely unified and that never changes. It just seems to be totally unscientific and unrealistic. And so what Feser takes from this is not that Parmenides and Zeno on the one hand, the Eleatics and Heraclitus on the other, are really live options for us. We know that both of those are non-starters, for Feser at least. These are not likely to be convincing to any person, either on the basis of common sense or on the basis of an affirmation of the successes of science. So what we have to do is explain then how change is possible. And here's where we get the third option, of course, of Aristotle. And Feser is essentially arguing this way. The consideration of these pre-Socratic philosophers shows us that we have to have some philosophical way of accounting for the very possibility of both change and permanence. we can't do without either one. If we try to do without either one, as the Eleatics and Heraclitus did, we end up with an absurd and obviously non-viable position. So we need both of these, and that's what Aristotle is trying to do. He's trying to give us an account of how it is that we can have both of these possibilities at once. And here's where we get the distinction that will become best known in scholasticism as the distinction between act and potency, which we've already been talking about as a distinction between actuality and potentiality. Although, as we'll see in the scholastics, there's a great deal of additional refinements and distinctions that is made to this pair of concepts. Okay, so the easiest way to think about where this directly derives is to think about this Parmenidean argument that we started with, that Parmenides says, okay, so there's a binary choice here. Either there's being or there's non-being. And so we can't possibly account for change because it would have to come out of non-being, and out of non-being nothing comes, and therefore there's only being, so therefore there's no change. But Aristotle's response is to say that being is spoken of in many ways. And the scholastics followed him in this. But in particular, there are two different kinds of being. There's being in act, and being in potency. So these represent two kinds of being. And so we can say, therefore, that something can change not because it comes from nothing, from non-being. That is indeed metaphysically impossible, maybe even logically impossible. However, actuality, being in act, can come out of being in potency or potential being. So there's no contradiction there. Being comes from being, but being in act comes from being in potency. So here's how we get the account. So he summarizes, if you look on 35 to 36, he says, we have then the following basic argument for the distinction between potency and act. That change and permanence, multiplicity and unity are all real features of the world cannot coherently be denied. But they can be real features of the world only if there is a distinction in things between what they are in act and what they are in potency. Therefore, there is a distinction to be made in things between what they are in act and what they are in potency. So this aims to basically argue that if we are to avoid the absurdity of the Eleatic position or the Heraclitean position, we have to suppose something like a distinction of act and potency. Now, of course, we could use different terminology. This is technical philosophical terminology, but something like this idea of a potency or a potential to be versus an actual being or being in act, something along the lines of that distinction needs to be made. Otherwise, we end up with a denial of things that really can't be denied, namely our everyday experience of ourselves and the world around us, and of scientific success. So that's the first part here. So this leads to a first discussion question. And that is, has Feser really proved that act and potency are metaphysically necessary concepts or a metaphysically necessary distinction? Has Feser really proved that act and potency are metaphysically necessary concepts, a metaphysically necessary distinction? Are there any other ways in which we might avoid this antinomy, as I'm calling it? I don't know if you're familiar with this word, made most famous probably by Kant, an antinomy, which is an opposition of principles, opposition essentially of two extreme positions. So are there any other ways in which this particular antinomy could be solved other than appealing to act and potency? So that's the first question. Has Feser shown that this metaphysical distinction between act and potency is really a necessary distinction? Are there any other potential ways in which we could distinguish, or rather overcome this antinomy between the Eleatics and the Heracliteans, both of which lead to absurd positions? Okay. So he next goes on, this is 1.1.2, to talk about the relationship between act and potency. And he says, if act and potency are, this is 36 here, if act and potency are distinct features of a thing, we must still address the question of what kind of distinction we are talking about. For scholastic writers commonly differentiate between real distinctions and logical distinctions. And that's not too hard to understand. So here's the first thing we want to say, is that our act and potency in the realm of distinctions are we talking about a real distinction, a distinction of actually in reality itself, or are we talking merely about a logical distinction, which is to say a distinction about the way in which we think about things, the way in which we conceptualize things? He mentions that that exhausts the options for Thomas Aquinas, but that here he begins the first of his sort of running commentaries. You could kind of view this as sort of a kind of a secondary project, which is to relate the different forms of scholasticism to each other. So you have Thomism after Thomas Aquinas, and then you have the other two main schools you'll be considering. Actually, maybe three. You have Scotus, the Scotus as they're called, John Duns Scotus, and Francisco Suarezans. And then you have also occasionally he'll mention other figures as well, William of Ockham, Nicholas of Agincourt, and so on. So you have other figures that are involved here as well. So the Scotus will say, well, there's a third option in here as well, that it's a mere formal distinction. But I think the initial question that would arise for anyone would be, is this merely a distinction in the way we think about things, or is this something that really exists in reality? And we've seen in Aristotle the way in which the concept of potentiality or potency has a kind of uneasy place within metaphysics. And so it's tempting sometimes to think that maybe it doesn't really exist in reality, but just exists in the way in which we think about things. Another question that arises is the question of limitation. So Feser raises this question: what accounts for limitation on being? What accounts for the limitation on the being of a thing? And in particular, what accounts for the limitations of its actuality? And the answer, classically, for Thomas Aquinas is that actuality or act is limited by potency. And this is a somewhat perhaps odd way of thinking about it. So we know that in the case of the kinds of entities that we encounter in our everyday life, both ourselves and the things around us, that they have a certain actuality, but their actuality is not unlimited. They have a certain limited size, no matter how big they are, or no matter how small they are. There's a limit to how small something can be as well. So those are the limits. limit in size, limit in the various qualities it has. So some things have the ability to have a certain type of causal efficacy. For example, they can heat things or cause things to catch on fire, or they can cause things to be magnetically attracted to them, or they can cause things to let's say be stable. If you're thinking about the structure of a building or something like that, the various capacities it has. But these capacities have a limit. Things have the capacity to stabilize a building, but it's not a limitless capacity. Maybe you can withstand a Category 3 earthquake, but not a Category 4, for example. Something can resist heat, but only up to a certain temperature and so forth. So the question of the limitation of being is a question of the limitation of its actuality here. And the question is, what is it that explains the limitation? There's another aspect of this. Not only the perfections of the thing, you could say. So you have the perfections of the thing, which is to say those things that are realized in it. That sense of perfection. So which perfections does it have? Which things are realized in it? But then also there's sort of the question of to what degree. And so if we think about any particular property, Feser uses the example of the roundness of a ball. We realize that, that thing is something that may or may not be actualized in a particular thing. It may or may not be a perfection that it has. But also there's a question about to what degree is it perfected in a thing. And here we get closer, I think, to our ordinary use of the term perfection, where we can ask, well, is it perfectly round? In that sense, is it absolutely round? Or is there some slight imperfection in its roundness? And in the everyday world, there's not going to be anything, of course, that's perfectly round. There's always going to be some slight imperfection, however small it may be. And so the question of the limitations of things is also addressed by Feser here. And the way in which the potency accounts for the limitations is explained by Thomas Aquinas in this inset quote on page 37, where he says, "Because act is perfection, it is limited only by potency, which is a capacity for perfection. Hence, a pure act in any order of being exists only as unlimited and unique. But wherever it act is finite and multiplied, there it unites in true composition with potency." So the idea is that the potency, which we can think of in terms of the powers of the material substrate that makes something up, in this example, the potency has certain capacities, but these capacities are limited. And so it's looking to the potency of something, or the potentiality, that we explain why it's limited in the way it is. So if you have, again, we'll take Feser's example. If you have a rubber ball, rubber is what realizes the roundness. Rubber is able to be round or spherical, but not perfectly so, only to certain degrees. And so that's why there's a limitation to the roundness of this ball. Again, he distinguishes this position from the position of the Scotus and the Suarezians, who argued alternatively that actuality or act is limited by its cause. So this is, we get the position of Thomas Aquinas, who we'll just refer to, according to the convention, as Thomas, versus the position of the Scotists and the Suarezians. He probably should have said Scotus and Suarez here to make it match up. But anyway, their view is that the limitation is accounted for in terms of the cause. So the cause of the thing only puts so much roundness into it. So this, if you think about the round ball, probably manufactured in China in some toy factory somewhere or whatever, the ball is not supposed to be as round as, let's say, precision ball bearing in some piece of machinery, because it doesn't need to serve that precise function that this precision ball bearing and the piece of machinery needs to serve. So it just needs to be, round enough to be able to function as a ball for kids to throw against a wall or whatever. It doesn't need to have that other degree of roundness. And of course, in general, we can also remind ourselves that a ball doesn't need to have every perfection. It only needs to have certain perfections. You don't need to be able to use a ball to be able to chop wood or something like that. That's because the cause of the ball isn't intending to create something that has that particular power. And so the cause is what accounts for the restriction on things. Okay, on 38 then we get some summary of the ways in which actuality is prior to potentiality. And this is something that I think we can cover pretty quickly because we just talked about that in relationship to Aristotle's view that actuality is prior to potentiality. So Feser lays this out pretty clearly, 4 ways in which actuality is prior to potentiality. One corresponds to what Aristotle talked about as the priority in account. So act is prior or more fundamental to potency in the sense that a potency is always defined in relation to an act. The potency for cutting is defined in relationship to what it is to actually cut. The potency for being round is defined in relationship to things that are actually round, and so on. So potency is always defined in relation to act. Second, a thing's potencies are grounded in its actualities. So it's because of the actual condition of a particular material object, for example, that it has the potency to cut. It's because that the axe is actually sharp, or the knife is actually sharp, that it has the potency or the power to cut. A potency can be actualized only by what is already actual. This was what Aristotle described in relationship to the substantial priority of actuality to potentiality. So, if you think about the alteration or the change in something, Feser talks about melting a rubber ball. So the rubber ball has the potentiality to be squishy. But in order for it to actualize that potentiality, there has to be something actual that is going to act upon that ball in order to actualize it. Some source of heat in this case. So something can be actual without necessarily having a potential, but something can't actualize its potentials or really have a potential without there being something to actualize that potential. He says a potency can be actualized only by what is already actual. If they are to be actualized, it can only be something already actual, like the heat of the oven, which actualizes them. And then finally, act is prior to potency insofar as, well, there can be nothing that is pure potency. There can be something which is pure act. While there can be nothing that is pure potency, there can be something which is pure act. So remember, pure potency, something that's purely potential, that's never actual, for Aristotle was equated with nothingness. Here again, the scholastics follow him in this respect. A pure potency can never be real. It doesn't have being. But there can be a pure actuality, as we saw in Aristotle. And the scholastics, once again, will follow him with this. It's God that is pure act, pure actuality. Okay. So after these preliminaries, then, Feser goes through and talks about all these distinctions. So I'm going to try to go through these. So first of all, we have the divisions of potency. So there's potency, and the first distinction within potency is between just a pure logical possibility versus a real potency. And actually, I think, technically speaking, this isn't really a potency, but something just to be contrasted with potency, so that we see that a potency is not merely a logical possibility, but a real potentiality. We talked about this before, that the idea that there's something positive in the idea of potentiality in the Aristotelian tradition. It's not merely a logical possibility. So we're not talking here just about fanciful, creatures like unicorns and griffins and these sorts of things that are logically possible, even though they don't exist. But we're talking about something that actually exists in the nature of real things, not that merely exists in the imagination. So the real potencies of firewood to burn, and trees to produce fruit and things like this. Not the logical possibility that there could be a flying unicorn that would take you to Mars or something like that. Okay, so the next distinction here is between, and I'm going to need more space, so I'm going to move this around a little bit here. That's the distinction within the realm of real potencies between active and passive potencies. Active and passive potencies. So we discussed this in relationship to Aristotle as well, the idea of active potentialities versus passive potentialities. Where the active is the capacity to bring about some effect, to act in such a way as to bring something about, whereas there's this corresponding passive potentiality, which is the capacity to be acted upon and to have something be brought about within a particular substance. Okay, so then going into the next distinction, we have one between, reminding myself of the order in which he does this. If you look at the active, there's a distinction between uncreated or pure real active potencies and created or mixed real active potencies. So this is a correspondence between basically God and human beings or other natural creatures who can act as agents, but who aren't pure act, who have active reality, active force, active power, but at the same time have potentialities that are not active. And then we have the passive in two ways. In relation to the thing that has it, and in relation to the agent that brings out an effect in a thing. So passive potencies, the capacity to be acted upon, can be either in relation to the, can be considered at least either in relation to the thing that has it or in relation to the agent who's able to bring out an effect in a thing. And this can be further explained, but we need more whiteboard, so we're going to take that last pair of distinctions, which means I have to write it out again, in relation to the thing that has it, and in relation to an agent that brings about an effect. In the thing that has it. So these are both the passive potencies. Passive potencies in relation to the thing that, put this close so you can see, in relation to the thing that has it and in relation to the agent that brings about an effect in the thing that has it. And here, we want to make a distinction in the first case between in the thing's essence and its existence. So a passive potency that pertains to a thing's essence versus a passive potency that pertains to a thing's existence. This one is sort of self-explanatory, passive potency to be brought into existence. The essence has a couple different and perhaps not as obvious categories underneath it. And that is the prime matter, or the, I don't know if it's secondary, the prime matter and the second matter. So the essence of the thing in relation to its prime matter is the ability to take on some form in the original or basic sense, to have a form that is the thing that sort of makes it into a substance in the first place, right? Because remember that the prime matter is understood as being the sort of pure potentiality of something to become a substance, to take on a form, the basic form. And then the second matter, though, is going to be relative to whatever that initial form is, which is going to lead to a particular kind of matter that's relative to the substantial compound. And so this leads to the second matter, the matter which has taken on some substantial form, but is in potency relative to the reception of some accidental form. So the idea being that if you take on the form of if prime matter takes on the form of a human being, of a rational animal, let's say, then now that form has the capacity to take on, has a potentiality rather, to take on an accidental form, the capacity for speech. So this is a second type of essence. Or rather potentiality in relation to the essence. Okay. I accidentally got a piece of ice in there. All right. What about this second level in relation to an agent that brings about an effect in the thing that has it? What pertains to that? He talks about the natural potencies, which are basically the natural potentialities of natural things, and then the supernatural, which are, of course, those potentialities we have to be receptive to God and God's agency. All right, so those are the passive. Then, in the case of actuality, we get the following. I'll try to go a little faster here. So, once again, we have, under actuality, the distinction between a pure act and a mixed act. The pure can be either absolutely pure or relatively pure, which corresponds to God and angels, who, for Aquinas, are described as being pure forms. So, purely spiritual beings. Then you have mixed actuality, operative, and entitative. So the mixed actualities are going to be, of course, those actualities in compound substances that also have potentiality or passivity in them. And so the operative are going to be the actualities where they actually act. The entitative is going to correspond, once again, to the essential and the existence. So the act of existing, that's an important sort of scholastic concept, the idea that existence is itself an act. We have a capacity to act as existence. But there also are essential acts, namely acts that are performed by virtue of the kind of substantial and accidental forms that we have. And I ran out of board here, but that would be where the final branch would be between, we'll go north here. Those acts that pertain to the substantial form, which is called the first act, and those that pertain to accidental forms, which is the second. So again, you have, say, in the case of human beings, the substantial is the first act, which would be the capacity to reason, which is the basis of everything else that belongs to a human being, qua human being. And the second would be something like the act of speech. And that might have just been a fail there, second. You can't really read that. But anyway, so that's the idea. Okay, so these are some of these distinctions to keep in mind as we go through. But the heart of what he wants to get at here is the idea of the causal powers. So what is this theory of causal powers? We remember the four causes from the discussion of Aristotle. So we have the material, the formal, the efficient, and the final causes. Here, though, we're narrowing our focus in particular to causality as it's understood in the modern tradition, modern philosophy, especially in analytic metaphysics, which is going to focus particularly on the efficient cause. So the efficient cause is the cause that brings something into being or that initiates a change. The cause that brings something into being or that initiates a change in some way or other. The most important point that, really, I think two important points about this initial connection between the idea of powers and causes, especially efficient causes. One point is that the cause, one of my pens here is dying, that's why I brought it back up. So cause is not always producing its effect. A cause is not always producing its effect. Now, there's a tendency in the modern period, as we'll see, to think that a cause is something just like perhaps an event or a state of the world or something like that. And so it exists as this kind of occurrent thing, something that occurs or that happens. And it happens when it's producing its effect. So this is actually a very different view from what tends to be assumed, I think, in modern philosophy, because here the cause is not understood to be something that is always producing its effect. And I think the clearest way to see how this can make sense is that the cause is understood to be a substance, or something possessed by the substance, I guess you could say. The cause is not something that is, as it were, floating freely as a kind of happening or temporal stage of the universe or something like that. But the cause is actually in the substance. And so, in that sense, we could say that the cause of the painting is the painter. It's the painter who is the efficient cause of the painting. And you remember that this kind of language was the kind of language that Aristotle used as well. He talked about, the builder being the cause of the building. The builder is the cause of the house. So it's not that the cause is some kind of event of the hammering or something like that, but or the erecting of the beams that are supporting the house, but rather it's the agent who is the cause. So in that respect, the causal power of something is in the substance. And that implies that this notion of actuality and potentiality has a intrinsic role to play in the scholastic understanding of causal powers. Because we want to be able to distinguish the powers of the cause, that is to say, its potentialities to act, from the actual acts or actions of the cause. The cause is not always producing its effect, but it does always have the power. It always has the potentiality to produce the effect, but it's not always doing it. Right? So the cause is something that possesses actuality when it's actively exercising its power, but it doesn't need to always be exercising its power. He notes that this seems to frame the idea of a causal power as a special case of the limitation of act by potency. So the causal powers of a thing are understood to be those capacities that are able to be exercised given the potentialities or the potencies within a particular substance. The causal power, he says, this is the middle of 43, a causal power qua potency just is that which limits efficacy of the actual and unlimited to a specific range of outcomes. Causal power qua potency just is that which limits efficacy of itself actual and unlimited to a specific range of outcomes. So everything is going to have specific causal powers, but the causal power is the potencies that the thing has, meaning the specific outcomes that it can produce. And that is a way of describing the limitations of the thing. It's also a way of describing, of course, the capacities of the thing. Those are two sides of the same coin here. What role does this play, though, this notion of a causal power? Feser goes on to say, and this is the bottom of 44, that this notion of a causal power, so described, is meant to be a metaphysical notion that's addressing a deeper question than the questions that the empirical investigator is trying to answer when they're investigating the causal powers of, let's say, a particular chemical substance, for example. The empirical investigator is trying to understand sort of what is the vehicle, or the mechanism would be a modern way to put it, by which a particular substance is able to exercise whatever capacities it has qua that substance. So, what is the mechanism? What is the elemental structure, for example, that enables, and the various laws of nature and so on, that enable a particular chemical substance to have the capacities it has, for example, to dissolve some other substance, etc. Obviously, the metaphysician is not competent or interested in that question. What question is the metaphysician interested in? He says on the bottom of 44, the philosopher is addressing a deeper question than the chemist is. The question not about the substance per se, opium is the example here, but about the necessary preconditions of there being any causality at all, in this case or any other case. So it's the metaphysics of causality, and this will become clear as we work through the rest of this chapter and the next, is addressing the question, what is it to, or for there to be a cause in the first place, a cause of any kind? What is a cause? What is it for there to be a cause? What are we claiming when we're saying that X causes Y? Okay. So that leads me to the second discussion question, looking at pages basically 43 through 45 in Feser's text. Second discussion question is, does the division of labor that Feser suggests between empirical science and its investigation of particular causes and metaphysics and its explanation of the nature of causality, does that division of labor make sense? Are they, in fact, two separate modes of inquiry, the empirical investigation of particular causes and the metaphysician's investigation into the nature of causality? Okay? And then, how do you think that these two forms of investigation intersect or interact? How do they interact? What's the relationship going to be, if any, between the empirical investigation of causes and the philosophical investigation into the nature of causality? For example, is one going to be dependent on the other? Do we need to know quite a lot about, let's say, what chemistry tells us about chemical causes, or what physics tells us about physical causes, etc., in order to be able to do metaphysics? Or is it the other way around? Do we need to have some kind of metaphysical understanding of the nature of causality in order to do science? So that's the question, basically. Does Feser's division of labor between the empirical investigation of causation in particular fields of science and the metaphysical investigation into the nature of causality, is that a distinction that makes sense? And if so, how do those two inquiries, modes of inquiry, relate to one another in this respect? Okay. So the Scholastic is going to claim that in order to make sense of the fact that I'm continuing reading Feser here, in order to make sense of the fact that a cause is not constantly bringing about its characteristic effects, and that its efficacy always involves real change, and that its efficacy is limited in just the ways that it is, we have to affirm the existence of active potencies or causal powers. In other words, that the very intelligibility of the notion of cause or causal power depends upon this act-potency distinction. And that's what he wants to go on to say. Okay, so we're at the hour mark here. We didn't get through quite as much as I wanted to in this video. I'd hope to begin some of this historical background, but I think what I will go ahead and do is just start that in the next video for next time. So we just have these two discussion questions then for this one. We'll continue on with some discussion of the later scholastics and the early modern philosophers and how that set up this problem about causation that has set the stage for analytic metaphysics. So there's going to be quite a bit of historical unfolding to occur in this next aspect of Feser's exposition, and we'll cover that next time.